Join us on the program right now, NRA President David Keene. David, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always.
It is a national day of action to demand a plan to reduce gun violence, according to President Obama. A lot of events scheduled around the country. The president himself hosting a speech at the White House, families from Newtown behind him. And clearly, David, this is this is by my count the third big push by Organizing for Action / Team Obama to try to rally public support for gun control, and it comes at a time in which we've seen a number of polls say that support for gun control is slipping.
That's exactly right. You know, I think that the White House and Mayor Bloomberg of New York and the rest of them have been surprised at the reaction of Americans to their proposals to really restrict Second Amendment rights. They thought that in the Newtown tragedy, they had something that was going to change the political landscape completely, and they were going to be able to ram their agenda through the Congress, for example, Andrew Cuomo did in New York with his state legislature. That hasn't happened because as time has gone on, two things have happened. One, gun owners and believers in freedom and believers in the Constitution and the Second Amendment have stepped up to the plate and said, wait a minute, we don't want you to do this because it changes the nature of our society, it restricts our rights, and it won't do a darn thing to prevent the kind of tragedy you say you want to prevent in the future. And secondly, because of the fact that these folks have stepped up and because some time has gone by, we're getting a much more rational discussion now than we had right after the Newtown tragedy. And we've always felt that given the empirical evidence, given the Supreme Court decisions, and given the fact that ultimately elected officials both listen to reason and, just as importantly, or perhaps more importantly in this case, listen to their constituents, that they were going to have a hard time doing what they wanted to do. And this is really their third attempt to get the traction that they haven't had. It's why Michael Bloomberg announced on Sunday that during this recess he's going to spend $12 million advertising in favor of gun control in targeted states. And that isn't working either. They aren't generating the grassroots support that they hoped they would generate. And frankly, in a lot of those states, people are rising up and saying, wait a minute, you can't come in here with that kind of money and just expect to buy the senators and congressmen from our state. It's not going to happen.
Absolutely. And you know, I saw Senator Heitkamp in North Dakota making a big issue of this earlier this week, saying that, you know, look, Bloomberg's prescriptions for North Dakotans are not what North Dakotans want. We have a lot of gun owners in this state, and we have a very low crime rate in this state. And, you know, and I was glad to see her point that out because I think the two things are correlated.
And that's exactly right. And, you know, Cam, she's a freshman Democratic senator. Within weeks of her election, the Obama forces and the Bloomberg forces went after her because she dared to suggest that what the president and his friends were proposing was an extremist solution to a problem that wouldn't in fact solve the problem, but would, in consequence of what they were proposing, restrict the rights of her constituents. Because she said that, they began running attack ads in her state. They're now doing that around the country. But I don't think it's going to work. I've not thought it was going to work from the beginning. We're in a tough war. We're in a tough battle. And as you know, they've won a couple of those battles. They've won more than they thought they were going to win in New York because they just bypassed the legislative process and had the governor force through a bill that nobody even had a chance to look at, sort of his version of Obamacare for guns. And then we lost some ground in Colorado because liberals had taken over both houses of the legislature out there. And we've got Martin O'Malley in Maryland attempting to come through with draconian restrictions on firearm sales and possession. But even there, even in a state like Maryland, which is ultimately a one-party state, things are bogged down in the State House because legislators have been shocked at the number of people who have not just shown up, but who've called and written and said, don't do this, because if you do, there's going to be a price that's going to be paid.
Well, absolutely. And look, this is, and David, I know you'd agree with me, the Second Amendment should never be a Republican right or
That's
a conservative
exactly
right.
And what we're learning now is that it is not. I mean, we have, as you know, Cam, the National Rifle Association is not a partisan organization,
Right.
And one of the reasons that the president has had so much trouble is that there are a number of Democrats in the Congress, and particularly in the Senate, who have in the past been strong Second Amendment supporters because it's not a partisan issue. And they are reluctant to abandon the Constitution just because this president and a New York City mayor want him to do that. So it's not partisan. It shouldn't be partisan. The Constitution wasn't written to benefit one party or the other. It was written, and the Bill of Rights was included in it, and the Second Amendment was included in the Bill of Rights by the founders because it goes to the very nature of what's needed to maintain a free society.
So, David, where do you think things stand right now? And first of all, I guess even before that, I've got to ask you, has there been any change in the NRA's position? I know that there's been some news stories out this week suggesting that the NRA is talking about background checks with members of the Senate.
You know, we'll talk to anybody about anything. We will not surrender our position. We will not surrender our support of the Second Amendment. We will not go along with feel-good measures that senators might want to have so they can please their president. That's not happening.
Okay. All right. Now, where do you think things stand right now in the Senate? I mean, we still don't have the supposed final language for the background check bill, do we?
No. Senator Schumer has an old bill, which is really a placeholder that he's introduced. And when the Senate comes back and they do their markup, they'll come up with the real bill that they're going to try and push this year. That'll be subject to amendment. It'll be subject to a lengthy debate. It's clear what Chuck Schumer wants. He'd like something like his old bill. He'd like to make it illegal for family transactions. He'd like to make it illegal for you to let me use your gun at a gun range, or for you to let your neighbor use your shotgun to go duck hunting. But I don't think he's going to get that. He's not going to get that because they do not want many of the senators who are going to be running for re-election in 2014 to have to vote for such legislation. So there's going to be something that's scaled down. The real question comes, and this is why the earlier talks between Schumer on the one hand and Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Coburn of Oklahoma broke down, is that both Coburn and Manchin had pledged, and we'll see if they stick with this pledge, and that is that they would not go along with anything that included a gun registry and national registration. That's what Schumer wants. That's what this is all about. And believe me, we're not going to tolerate anything like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how many gun control advocates are now talking about how a firearms registry and a registration system that would never happen, but we need record keeping, because without record keeping,
how can we have a registry without record keeping?
I actually saw a gun control advocate say today that when somebody actually went through a background check, that was next to useless. It really didn't matter anyway because we need the so-called universal background checks. If that's the case, then why not just scrap the NICS system? I mean, if what we have, they say now, is just utterly worthless, I mean, they really do want universal background checks, but they need that record-keeping requirement, which is just really, David, a decentralized registry. The records are still there. They're just not in one place.
Yeah, the universal check that they want is really an excuse to establish a national gun registry that they can later use for whatever purposes they might want to use it. And, there are a lot of reasons why that's a very bad idea. There are a lot of reasons why Congress, with our support, passed legislation some years ago making it illegal to maintain records on honest Americans who purchase firearms. When you go into a gun store, when you go to a gun show and buy a firearm from a licensed dealer, you undergo a background check. If you pass that check, that record has to be destroyed within 24 hours because there's no reason for the government to maintain that kind of a registry. If you flunk the background check, if you're a criminal, they keep that record so that they can prosecute you, something that they never do. But the fact of the matter is that there are very strong reasons not to allow a gun registry. In the old days, if you assumed the best of motives on the part of the government, that the government would never want to take your firearms, was actually composed of Second Amendment supporters and actually believed, as Barack Obama said in the campaign, that he'd never take your shotgun, he'd never take your rifle, he'd never take your sidearm. you could put together such a registry and lock it in a vault. I don't happen to believe in the long term that you should view the government as that beneficial, as that benevolent. But you could do that. Today, the government can't even keep a nuclear secret. We saw what happened in New York with the license holders for pistols, which were published in a newspaper, causing all kinds of problems, burglaries, threats against law enforcement officers and prison guards and the like. And we saw that Gawker got hold of a lot of gun information and published it. So there are privacy reasons, there are constitutional reasons, and there are very good historical and policy reasons why the American people should never want to support a national gun registry.
David, on this National Day of Action, what action should gun owners be taking?
They need to be visibly in support of their rights. They need to let policymakers, federal policymakers, state policymakers, local policymakers know that the support for the Second Amendment is as strong or stronger than it's ever been, and that as gun owners and believers in freedom and believers in the Second Amendment, we support those who stand with us, and those who oppose our historic constitutional rights will have a problem at the ballot box the next time we have a chance to get them there. And that's what democracy is all about. That's what constituents are about in a congressional district, a state, or nationally. And it's what gun owners have to do. They have to let their elected officials know constantly that they care deeply about the rights that the founders gave us. And I talked to a congressman recently who's actually from a gun-friendly district. He's been rated A by the NRA every time he's run. And he said to me, in the last few weeks, I've gotten 5,000 calls from my constituents, and they are all saying, look, we know you've always been A-rated, but that was then. This is now. We want to know what you're going to do for us today and tomorrow. And he said, imagine what kind of influence that has on people that are on the fence, people that are wavering, people that might give in to pressure from their president or from their party or from their legislative leaders. Every single member of Congress, Republican, Democrat alike, have to know that gun owners care and that gun owners and Second Amendment believers are among the votes that they need to keep their jobs. That's what a democratic system is all about.
Absolutely. David, thank you so much, sir, for your time. Always great having you on the show, and look forward to doing it again very soon.
Anytime. Thanks, Cam.